At the end of the Cretaceous period, an era dominated by hard scales and cold-blooded killing, nature left behind an almost absurdly tender miracle in the wilderness of South America. It possessed the agile skeleton and sharp claws of a raptor, yet from head to toe, it was covered in layers of fluffy long feathers, as delicate as velvet and as rich as a high-end silk duvet. This mysterious creature, later known as Unenlagia, used its unique half-bird, half-body to write the most incredible destiny of contrast in the cold history of evolution. Tonight, by the gently flickering firelight, and with this story that requires no effort to remember, let us enter her true life. Scientific fossil specimens always discuss her running speed and skeletal structure, but they often overlook the physical temperature radiated by those feathers in the dark of night. In that deep autumn epoch, when the climate was gradually turning colder and all predators were using fangs and claws to fight for survival space, she possessed the most relaxed and healing sleep ritual in the entire dinosaur kingdom. Her life was never about flying in the sky, but about building an absolute barrier on the cold ground with warmth, uninvaded by the outside world. Whenever night fell and the cold wind swept through the wasteland carrying withered fern leaves, this peculiar creature would return to her nest and begin a hypnotic magic trick of touch. That was not weakness, but a kind of profound peace granted to herself and the surrounding world through ultimate delicacy and encompassment in an extremely brutal era. There is no need to fight the sharp edges of this world. Now, please let your thoughts drift along with her slowly closing wings, sinking together into that constant temperature ancient dreamland. Destiny's Fisher often appears in that first deep autumn frost during the changing of seasons. That year, the Patagonia Plateau of the Cretaceous period welcomed an unprecedented cold snap, and the originally warm air was replaced overnight by a killing chill. The Unenlagia stood at the edge of a yellowing Araucaria forest, the early morning frost condensing on her long snout, turning into wisps of white breath. She looked down at her slender forelimbs, where the feathers were long and draping, swaying gently with the ice-laden breeze, making fine rustling sounds like friction on silk. In the surrounding jungle, those hard-skinned dinosaurs, usually accustomed to rampaging through, were now fleeing in all directions due to the sudden drop in temperature, their scales clashing with sharp sounds against the frozen thickets. In this highly tense ecological reorganization, the Unenlagia did not participate in any useless territorial disputes. Her gaze remained fixed on those weak lives shivering in the cold wind. She saw primitive mammals frozen unable to move at the roots of giant trees, and ancient birds whose wings were glued by frost, unable to take flight. The large predators covered in scales disdained these insignificant morsels of food, or only thought of crushing them beneath heavy footprints. But a natural instinct awoke within the Unenlagia's body, an instinct not of hunger, but of sensitivity to temperature, a tenderness looking for kind in the cold. She slightly crouched her signature half-bird body, extremely gently sweeping away the frost on the ground with the long feathers of her forelimbs, and began to build a haven capable of containing this winter. The process of building the nest was a long cultivation for the Unenlagia, transforming nature's roughness into ultimate delicacy. She wandered untiringly across the wasteland, using that long bill with fine serrations to carefully select the softest building materials in the entire forest. Not hard branches, nor flower stalks with stinging sensations, but layers upon layers of dry moss blown down by the autumn wind, and soft needles fallen from coniferous trees bearing a faint scent of pine resin. She stamped these materials solid with her foot claws and pressed them repeatedly with her body into the most perfect curve, until the nest presented a giant, deeply concave bowl shape. However, the true core of this nest was not those external plants, but the fluffy feathers on her own body obtained over millions of years of evolution. The midday sun shone into the forest with a trace of paleness. The Unenlagia sat quietly in the center of the nest and began to preen the long feathers on her chest and wings with her beak. That was a ritualistic process with a distinct rhythm, the tip of the beak sliding down the feather shaft, straightening the downy feathers clumped together by the cold one by one, allowing them to fill with air again. Following her preening, those feathers began to puff up like blown-up cotton candy, layer upon layer, forming a natural insulating layer in the air. The wind scraped past the treetops, making a sharp howl, but once close to the Unenlagia's nest, all sounds seemed to be absorbed by this layer of fluffy feathers, leaving only low, muffled thuds. In this prehistoric world full of power and strength maneuvering, she used such an extremely time-consuming, extremely restrained method to weave a silk duvet sufficient to resist the cold current of the era for herself. When the twilight, mixed with a deeper chill, completely swallowed the wasteland, the Ununlagia's nest began to radiate a unique life tension. She rested quietly in the nest, submissively curling her long tail by her side, her body stretched into a posture that was most relaxing. Right at this moment, those small creatures in the surrounding area facing desperation in the cold night, following the faint life temperature, began to gather toward this corner. An ancient bird with a damaged wing, completely lost in the dark night, bearing full body shivering, humbly moved to the edge of the nest. In the brutal logic of the daytime, such cross-species approach usually meant death, meant becoming a delicious meal in the other's mouth. But the Ununlagia only slightly opened those eyes that appeared incredibly gentle in the night gloom, calmly gazing at this uninvited guest, showing not a shred of hostility. On the contrary, she extremely slowly raised one of her forelimbs, that huge wing covered in silk-like long feathers resembling a slowly descending curtain. She did not use language, nor forceful movements, but simply responded to the flow of temperature in the air, taking this shivering small bird under her own wing. When that cold, stiff small body touched the 39 degrees Celsius constant temperature down feathers on the Ununlagia's skin surface, the small bird's originally rapid, terrified heartbeat miraculously slowed down within a few seconds. That was a tactile solace crossing species. In this unknown deep night, two distinctly different lives reached the quietest reconciliation under a bed of natural silk duvet. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the ancient wasteland struck up a freezing Cretaceous white noise. That was the soughing sound, resembling ocean waves, made by the wind blowing through tens of thousands of pine waves. The Ununlagia's nest had by now become a tiny micro-world constructed from temperature and trust. Besides the very first ancient bird, several small primitive mammals, struggling to survive beneath the feet of scaled dinosaurs, also squeezed in along the gaps in the feathers. They curled up on both sides of the Ununlagia's broad abdomen, burying their cold small noses into that thick, warm underbelly down feather that was like a high-end silk duvet. The Ununlagia slightly adjusted her posture. In order not to crush these fragile tenants, she precisely distributed her body's center of gravity across several thick bone support points. She began to breathe with her own specific rhythm. With every inhalation, her chest cavity slowly rose, those fluffy long feathers expanding accordingly, bringing up a very faint, warm flow of air. With every exhalation, her chest cavity sank gently, the long feathers folding layer upon layer, completely blocking the cold. Outside, radiating the animal's unique, reassuring faint body scent. In this rhythmic tactile rise and fall, all the small animals snuggled beside her completely abandoned their vigilance, their breathing gradually merging into one with the Ununlagia's breathing frequency. You could hear extremely delicate rustling sounds of long feathers rubbing together. That was a sound without any aggression, purer than any instrument invented by humans. This sound was amplified in the silent dark night, becoming an invisible hypnotic magnetic field, guiding every tightened nerve toward irreversible relaxation. This was the fragment closest to eternity in the entire long dark night. The Ununlagia used all her feathers to completely strip gravity and cold from this space. Her long and narrow head slowly drooped, gently resting upon the pile of fluffy long feathers of her forelimb, her eyelids presenting a warm and smooth texture under the illumination of the moonlight. Now, she no longer needed to maintain the vigilance of the daytime, nor did she need to think about where this epoch was heading. She was merely the guardian of this patch of warm land. Moonlight pierced through the sparse tree canopy, sprinkling on the edges of her layered feathers, halos of faint light resembling silver threads crowning those tiny barbules. Those small lives huddled in her embrace had already entered deep sleep completely, their small claws relaxed and open, their bodies rising and falling slightly with the Ununlagia's rise and fall. This ultimate sense of encompassment and lifting, through every contact between skin and feather, continuously diffused outward, as if the cold of the entire wasteland was being healed at this moment. The magic of touch lies precisely here. It does not require complex logic, does not require grand narratives, it only requires the purest physical contact to allow one to feel unconditional acceptance. The Ununlagia's body was stationary in the moonlight into a giant, constant temperature cloud, letting the outside world change as it may. Within this cloud there was forever only 39 degrees of attachment. Her destiny was sandwiched between the end of the dinosaurs and the rise of the birds, but on this ordinary deep autumn night, she transcended all evolutionary labels, leaving behind only pure tenderness. The sound of pine waves in the surroundings gradually lowered. The wind also seemed afraid of startling this prehistoric sound sleep, becoming lighter and lighter, softer and softer, when the eastern land began to faintly show the very first extremely restrained inner whiteness. This peculiar creature that was half bird, half beast finally completed her vigil over the dark night. Those small lives that spent the severe cold under her wing would depart quietly when dawn arrived, rethrowing themselves into their respective bustling yet brutal life trajectories. But they would forever remember that on that coldest deep autumn night of the Cretaceous period, there was once a huge, layered ancient silk duvet that blocked all frost for them. The Unenlagia's life left no earth-shattering fossil legends. The warmth she wove with feathers had already turned into nutrients for the soil in the millions of years of time. However, that physical memory regarding temperature, regarding encompassment, regarding complete relaxation, seemed to have been handed down to this very night through tiny evolutionary tentacles. If you are lying in your own bed right now, you might gently pull up your quilt, feeling that softness and thick comfort covering your skin. Imagine you are lying within the extremely fluffy, constant temperature comfortable long feathers of the Unenlagia, all anxiety, unease, and daytime fatigue completely insulated by this layer of feathers. Your body is becoming lighter and lighter, like a piece of fallen down feather, in the early morning breeze of ancient times, slowly, without any pressure, descending. The dark night has already passed, and that dreamland written with tenderness and encompassment has only just begun. The Unenlagia closed her eyes, and in the final silence before dawn, deeply, fell asleep.